The first made-for-cinema animated Tintin movie came to the theaters in 1969. It was produced by Belvision, the company responsible for the first Tintin cartoon series. From the series, the animation techniques have improved. The title of the movie was Tintin and the Temple of the Sun. Several writers are credited for this movie. Among Hergé, there's also Michel Renier, Greg. But could this movie meet the expectations of the fans? The story of the movie is an adaptation of the two-part Tintin adventure The Seven Crystal Balls and Prisoners of the Sun. As I've already reported on both stories, let's just look what the movie does different. So where are the changes in the story? By the way, if you take a closer look at the gentleman right here, this is a TV reporter. He's telling the story of the expedition that discovers the mummy of Raskar Kapak. And he looks like Hergé himself. As I mentioned, he was working on the script of the movie, but boy does this script deviate from the story in the comic books. Let's take a look at it, shall we? Now, the story of the first volume has been greatly shortened, so that Calculus is kidnapped after only 9 minutes of film, including the title song. Everything from the beginning of the comic book, Tintin and Haddock in the Variety and meeting General Alcazar, all this is dropped. The story of the expedition that finds the mummy of Raskar Kapak and brings it to Europe is given in a prologue. In the prologue it's mentioned that 5 of the 7 researchers have already fallen into deep sleep. Unlike in the comic book, in which the 5th researcher falls victim to an attack due to the carelessness of Thompson and Thompson. However, the attack on the 6th explorer is directly shown, and in contrast to the comic book, you can see that the Indians use a blowpipe with the crystal balls. For some reason that is not clearly explained, the mummy of Raskar Kapak is kept in Marlinspike Hall, instead of in Professor Tarragon's house. The whole sequence in which the mummy is struck by a ball of lightning and Tarragon speaks about the curse takes place there. In the same scene, Calculus also immediately takes the jewelry of Raskar Kapak, Tarragon is the victim of the last crystal ball attack, and Calculus is kidnapped. In the comic book, these events take place partly at night, partly on the next day. And it brings us to the question as to why Tintin and Haddock, who are in the room with Tarragon, do not also become victims of the vapors that the crystal ball emits after it has broken, and that puts people into the deep sleep. The hijackers flee with Calculus not in a car, but in a helicopter. Once more, it's a helicopter. So the whole sequence with the kidnappers changing cars and sinking the car in the ocean is dropped. Tintin and Haddock track down the ship Pachacamac, which brings Calculus and its kidnappers to South America, not through Calculus's head, but through a stuttering eyewitness who saw him aboard the ship. When Tintin sneaks aboard the Pachacamac in Peru, he immediately learns that the kidnappers' journey will go to Jauga. As a result, he, Haddock, and the Thompsons do not separate, and Thompson and Thompson are on the whole expedition to the Temple of the Sun. In the comic book, Thompson and Thompson follow a different trace all around the world and lose track of Tintin and Haddock. The 4 friends continue their way to Jauga with a trolley after their cart has been separated from the train. In the comic book, someone came looking after them after noticing that the train came in the station 1 wagon short. A completely new scene has been added in which the Pisco Festival is shown in Jauga. A pisco is the national drink of Peru, which Haddock is enthusiastic about. Tintin is not followed by the high priest of the Temple of the Sun. So when Tintin is meeting and helping Zorino, the priest does not give him the talisman. In the comic book, this talisman helps Zorino not get burned at the stake. We'll get to that later. Zorino does not wait for Tintin and his companions at the bridge, but rather along the river. A minor detail. The nightmare that Tintin has at the first dress is executed differently, but is no less disturbing. The events around the Indians kidnapping Zorino and the Condor taking away Snowy have been connected together. The Indians don't show up later because the whole scene in which Haddock chases the llamas across a snow-covered plain is executed differently. And the avalanche that follows is not caused by Haddock sneezing, but by the Thompsons shouting out loud. From the journey through the jungle there are some things missing as well, such as the encounter with the tapir or the anteater. The secret access to the Temple of the Sun is discovered in the same way as in the book, but there's no attempt to explain why it is not dark in the cave. The comic book speaks of phosphorizing stone. The scene where Tintin finds an old Inca grave is missing. The leader of the Inca has a daughter who begs for the life of Zorino and his companions. Yes, in that order. Unlike in the comic book, Zorino is also sentenced to death at the stake, which of course is related to the fact that he did not get the talisman as in the book, which I mentioned above. The execution is scheduled as in the book, but the Thompsons are also at the stake. And Calculus does not speak about that he considers the whole spectacle to be a Hollywood movie. When the Inca leader starts to destroy the voodoo dolls of the tortured scientists, it turns out that there was also a doll for Haddock, but it was not used. There is no explanation why this doll exists, nor why it was not used. The Inca leader only says, "You were supposed to suffer too." The scene where Haddock drinks water from a spring, which he then spits in the face of a llama, already takes place directly at the Temple of the Sun, and the saddlebags full of gold are not shown. And finally, I have to mention the two songs of the movie, one in which Zorino sings about the life in the jungle, the other a sad duet between him and the daughter of the Inca leader. Unfortunately, the film makes a rather hectic impression. And I don't really know if it's something for the Tintin fans, who of course know the story of the crystal balls and the prisoners of the sun word by word. The first 20 minutes of the movie seem like they wanted to get over the first volume of the two-part story very quickly, just to get to the actual subject of the movie, the Temple of the Sun. By this, unfortunately, little details get lost, for example, when it's not explained why the mummy of Ras Kakapak is in Marlinspike Hall. The only explanation out of the story is, of course, that the animators did not have to bring in a new location, Tarragon's house. And it's my personal guess that the voodoo doll of Haddock was inserted into the scene in the Temple of the Sun because Ras Kakapak's mummy was in Haddock's castle. But I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this movie. It is well crafted, it is not a bad movie per se, but it cannot match the comic books. The story is executed in the, well, I want to call it Belvision style, with a lot of liberties, as you've seen. And in some parts it looks like they wanted to make just a simple adventure movie for kids. And that does not suit to the comic stories of Tintin. On the other hand, they added more context or local color with the Pisco Festival. Yeah, well, as I said, it's a mixed bag. It's a fun, enjoyable movie, but it stays behind the two comic books. But when I look at the movie as what I suppose it's meant to be, a standalone thing, when I do not consider the comic books, then I can really enjoy all this. Well, with one exception, the two songs are really kitschy and mawkish. I think they were inserted because cartoon movies at the time had to have songs. Thanks, Disney. Well, after Tintin and the Temple of the Sun, there was only one sequel coming up. Strange, like with the real-life adventure movies of Tintin, they were only two. Always two they are. Does this have to mean something? Maybe, but maybe not. I don't know. Nevertheless, Tintin and the Temple of the Sun was an important milestone on the way to the next project. And the fans were eagerly waiting for new adventures as Hergé had slowed down his work on the comic series. To give you an example, the stories always continued with some breaks in between. Between the Red Sea Sharks and Tintin in Tibet, there were 2 years' time. Between Tintin and Tibet and the Castafiore Emerald, there were 3 years. And between the Castafiore Emerald and Flight 714 to Sydney, there were 5 years. And then there was a gap between this and the next adventure of 8 years. And this is the gap we're in right now with the Tintin stories.